One of the most common questions parents ask once they start exploring private school admissions is this: when should my child take the ISEE or SSAT? And what surprises many families is that most parents are thinking about this timeline completely backwards. In this video, I'm going to walk you through when most students actually take the test, why starting earlier can give families more flexibility, and how testing really fits into the broader admissions timeline. The reason this question causes so much uncertainty is that testing timelines can feel confusing at first. Families begin researching schools and quickly discover that many private schools require either the ISEE or the SSAT as part of their application process. They see references to percentiles, they hear other parents talk about testing strategies, and suddenly it feels like there's an entire system families are expected to understand. So parents begin wondering, should my child take the test this year? Should we wait until next year? Should they take the test more than once? How early is too early? And how late is too late? These are very normal questions because testing can feel like one of the most concrete parts of the admissions process. Unlike interviews or essays, testing produces a number. And when families see that number, it's natural to assume that timing the test correctly is extremely important. But what many families discover as they learn more about private school admissions is that testing timelines are actually more flexible than they first appear. Once you understand how testing fits into the broader admissions timeline, it becomes much easier to plan. Welcome to Admissions Insights. I'm Crystal Stone. Each week, I share reflections and patterns I'm seeing from families navigating private school admissions so you can approach the process with more clarity, confidence, and calm. Because when families are trying to understand this process on their own, it can feel confusing very quickly. My goal is to help parents see the bigger picture more clearly. Today, we're going to talk about testing timelines, and more specifically, when students typically take the ISEE or SSAT during the admissions process. Before discussing timing, it helps to understand the role testing actually plays in private school admissions. Standardized testing provides admissions committees with one additional piece of information about a student's academic readiness. Because applicants come from many different schools with different grading systems and curricula, testing offers a standardized way for admissions teams to evaluate certain academic skills. But testing is never the entire story. Admissions committees review testing results alongside transcripts, teacher recommendations, interviews, and other parts of the application. They're trying to understand the student as a learner. Testing helps provide context, but it's just one piece of the larger academic profile. Keeping that perspective in mind can make the entire testing process feel far less intimidating. The goal is not to chase a perfect score. The goal is simply to make sure the test reflects the student's academic readiness as clearly as possible. Once families begin researching private school admissions, the next practical question becomes, when do students actually take the test? Most private school applications are due during the winter. Many schools have application deadlines in January, and some extend into early February. Because of that timeline, students typically complete their official testing sometime during the fall or early winter of the application year. For example, if a student is applying for admission next fall, they will often take the ISEE or SSAT sometime between September and December of the current school year. That timeline allows testing to be completed before applications are submitted. But there's one important detail many families don't realize at first. Many students take the test more than once. This surprises some parents because it's easy to assume that standardized testing works like a one-time event. In reality, many students benefit from having the opportunity to take the test again after becoming familiar with the format. The first test often serves as an introduction. Students learn how the sections are structured, they experience the pacing of the exam, and they begin to understand how the questions are presented. Once students have that experience, they often feel much more comfortable approaching the test again. Because of that, many families plan their testing timeline in a way that allows room for flexibility. One strategy I often recommend to families is beginning the testing process earlier than you may initially expect. Rather than waiting until fall of the application year, some families choose to have their child take a baseline test in May. The purpose of this early test is not to achieve a perfect score, it's to gather useful information. A May test can show you exactly where a child's current academic profile stands. You can see how they perform across different sections, you can identify areas of strength, and you can see where additional preparation might make a meaningful difference. Instead of guessing where your child stands academically, you now have a clear baseline, and that baseline makes it much easier to make informed decisions about the next steps. Should your child take the test again in the fall? Would some focused preparation strengthen a particular section? Do the current scores already align well with the schools you're considering? Having that information early allows families to approach the rest of the admissions timeline much more strategically. And, perhaps more importantly, it reduces pressure. Because the first test is no longer the only opportunity, it's simply a starting point. Many students then choose to take the test again during the fall of the application year. By that point, students have had time to become more familiar with the exam. They understand the pacing of the sections, they recognize the types of questions that appear on the test, and they often feel far more confident walking into the testing room. Fall testing also allows families to review results well before application deadlines. If scores align well with the schools on the student's list, families can move forward with greater confidence. If there are areas where improvement might help strengthen the application, there still may be a little time to consider another test opportunity. Some students do take the test later in the admissions cycle, often during the winter months. This can still work, especially if families begin the admissions process later or if schools have slightly later deadlines. However, winter testing leaves less room for retesting if families decide another attempt might be helpful. That's why many families find it helpful to start the testing process earlier in the admissions timeline. Not because the first test must be perfect, but because earlier testing allows greater flexibility, and flexibility tends to make the entire process feel calmer for both the students and parents. One pattern I notice with many families is that testing feels intimidating at first, simply because the timeline isn't clear. Once parents understand how testing fits into the larger admissions plan, the anxiety around the test drops dramatically. Another important piece of the testing timeline is preparation. Preparation doesn't necessarily mean months of intense studying. In many cases, the most helpful preparation simply involves becoming familiar with the structure of the exam. Students benefit from seeing practice questions, they benefit from understanding how the sections are organized, and they benefit from experiencing the pacing of the test before sitting for the official exam. When students know what to expect, they can focus more clearly on the questions themselves rather than worrying about the format of the test. That familiarity alone can make a meaningful difference in how confident students feel on testing day. As families think about testing timelines, it's also helpful to remember that every student approaches standardized testing a little differently. Some students adjust quickly to the format and the pacing of the exam. Others benefit from a bit more time to become comfortable with the structure of the test. Because of these differences, testing strategies often look slightly different from one family to another. What matters most is giving students enough time to understand the exam and demonstrate their academic abilities clearly. Another helpful perspective is remembering how testing fits into the broader admissions process. Testing is one part of the application. Students are also submitting transcripts, teachers are writing recommendations, students may participate in interviews, families are researching schools and building thoughtful school lists. Admissions committees review all of these pieces together. Testing provides insight into academic reasoning skills. Grades reveal patterns of classroom performance. Teacher recommendations often describe work habits, curiosity, and engagement in the classroom. When those elements are considered together, admissions officers gain a much clearer understanding of the student as a learner. That's why testing is best viewed as one step within a much larger admissions journey. One reason testing timelines can feel confusing is that different schools sometimes publish slightly different information. Some schools recommend specific testing windows. Others simply state that testing must be completed before the application deadline. Parents may also hear conflicting advice from friends or online forums. One family may suggest testing as early as possible. Another may recommend waiting until the last moment. When families receive different recommendations, it can become difficult to know which approach makes the most sense. That's why it can be helpful to step back and focus on a few key questions instead. Does my child have enough time to become familiar with the exam? Will we have the flexibility if another test attempt might be helpful? And do we understand how testing fits into our overall admission strategy? When families begin thinking about testing through that lens, the timeline usually becomes much easier to plan. For many families, standardized testing initially feels like one of the most intimidating parts of the admissions process. But once the structure of the timeline becomes clear, the experience often feels much more manageable. Testing is simply one step in a larger process designed to help schools understand how students learn. Students are far more than a single score. Admissions committees know that, and they're evaluating the full academic picture when making admissions decisions. So if you remember just one thing from this video, let it be this. Testing timelines are not about finding a single perfect date. They're about giving your child enough time for preparation, flexibility, and clarity about where they stand academically. If you're early in the admissions journey and beginning to think about how testing fits into the broader process, these are exactly the kind of questions we explore here each week. Because when families gain clarity early, the entire admissions process often feels very different. Thank you for being here. If you're navigating private school admissions and want clear guidance each week, consider subscribing so you don't miss future admissions insights. I'll see you next time.